Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Huron. The cowboys' tales we ride, the stories of the West campfire, truths trail dust, memories saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Prospect Falls, Colorado territory. November. The first storm did not arrive so much as a race. Hills folded into sky, fences sank beneath drifts, the cottonwoods lost their edges. Wind went to work on everything that could not fight back. It slapped the cabin. On Coyote Draw rattled the frosted panes, sifted powder under the door. A lantern burned behind one small square of glass, a stubborn coin of light against the white. Far off where the ridge fell toward the frozen creek, a figure broke loose from the gray. She moved the way a wick does when it is almost out. Barefoot, dress ripped to threads that snapped in the gale, she kept coming. She cut across the last stretch with the look of someone who had been hungry long enough to forget the word for hungry. Snow glazed her hair, her hands were the color of old milk. She climbed the porch steps one by one, breath a small steam eyes on the dull glow inside. She lifted her knuckles and knocked once. She waited for breath. She knocked twice more. Then the wind took her balance. Her shoulder slid along the jamb. Her knees buckled. She tipped sideways and struck the step. Snow began to find the hollow of her collarbone. It collected in the torn hem as if the weather meant to tuck her in. The door pulled open on a rope of cold. Eli Rourke filled the frame hat in his hand, shoulders narrow and roped with work. He did not say a word. He looked down the length of the porch, the order where the storm had set her, and crossed the boards. He put the 2 fingers to the space below her lip and felt a ribbon of breath. He set his palm to her cheek. The cold there made his own skin ache. He slid his arms under her and lifted. She weighed like kindling. The lantern flame went long with the draft as he carried her in. The door swung on the wind, then shut with a crooked thud. Heat shouldered forward from the stone hearth. Fire snapped in a low grate cedar and juniper giving off a clean resin. Eli laid her on the settle near the coals, close enough that the red light could find her face. He hung his coat on her like a roof-heavy wool that smelled of horse and smoke. Her feet were raw, the soles scored the toes white and near numb. He tucked the coat under her calves, then reached for a kettle where broth kept a small talk. He set a cloth into the hot water, wrung it out until it no longer dripped, and pressed it to her forehead. A coal spat a strange green spark. It rose, died, left a small crown of ash. A board creaked in the hall. 2 shapes pushed out of the dark like fish from a pool. Ben stood first, 9 narrow and watchful hair, gone to a cowlick from sleep. He planted himself in front of his sister, without thinking about it. Maisie 5 clutched a frayed quilt to her chest, blue eyes round with the kind of alert that comes from living with weather. She stared at the girl on the settle, then at Eli, then back again. She took 1 step closer so the hem of her nightgown drank the warm air. A smear of soot ran along one cheek like a brave streak. She whispered in a voice made for secrets. She looks like the snow wanted to keep her. Eli did not take his hand from the cloth. He tipped his head toward Ben. Get the thick blanket, the blue one from the peg. Ben did not move at first. The set of his mouth had a straightenness he learned young, but he nodded once and vanished down the hall. Maisie moved to the other side of the settle, careful not to touch the coat. Her small fingers hovered above the stranger's hand, as if the hand were a bird she might frighten. The kettle hissed. Wind pressed along the logs as though it wanted to come in and argue. Eli changed the cloth. The girl's lashes gathered tiny beads of melt. Her lips parted as if she meant to say a name. Only a breath came out. Ben returned with the blanket all weight and wool, and stood with it folded tight and square the way Eli taught him to fold saddle pads. Eli lifted the coat long enough to spread the blanket. The blanket brought the smell of cedar chests and soap. It made a soft roof over the hard day. Maisie put her palm on the folded edge and left it there like a promise. Eli set the cloth aside and looked at the girl again. The pulse in her throat had found a steadier beat. He took a tilt from the kettle to the clay bowl on the mantel and poured it into a tin cup, then thought better of it. Not yet. He stood, rolled his shoulders once to unhook a knot, and looked past the settle to the room that had to make room. The cabin was small because he could keep it clean that way. Pegs along one wall held 2 hats, 1 faded bonnet no one touched, and a pair of women's boots gone dull with time. A wooden spoon rested on a shelf above the hearth. Someone had scratched a letter C near the handle with a nail and not sanded it smooth. The windows wore frost and lace. A broom leaned in the corner, where a knot of dust collected, as if dust also loved corners. Everything in the room belonged to somebody who did not like waste. Eli bent and lifted a loose board near the hearth. He slid the tin cup under out of sight of small hands and thin mouths and let the board fall back into place. Ben watched his father with a measuring gaze. He did not ask questions he could answer by watching. He carried the weight of the blanket and the weight of the look that comes to boys when the house loses a sound it used to have. Maisie finally spoke at her own speed. "Can she stay in the warm?" Eli looked at his daughter and then at the stranger's feet where the skin had torn and healed and torn again. He nodded once. "We do not put anyone back out into that." He walked to the door and set the bar a simple strip of oak. The wind pressed its shoulder against the cabin and did not come any farther. He stoked the coals. The green spark did not come back, only the slow glow of a bed of orange that meant the wood would last. The girl breathed deeper under the wool. A flush found her cheeks in small circles, as if someone had drawn them faint, and the heat was darkening the color. She opened her eyes long enough to see the ceiling knotholes smoke-stain the shadow of a horseshoe on a beam. She closed them again because sleep came like a tide and not like a choice. Eli sat on the low stool where he could reach the fire without leaving her. The kettle went on talking. Ben let the end of the blanket go, then took hold again as if it could float away. Maisie leaned her ear toward the stranger's chest and listened for a sound she could name. She smiled when she found it. Eli felt the night shift. The storm relented in a way a man who works outside can tell without looking. He stood and checked the latch twice, the way he always did. He set another log on the coals with the same care he used on animals and tools. He touched his fingers to the spoon on the shelf and left them there a moment, not so much for the spoon as for what his hand remembered. He took his coat from the girl and traded it for the blanket's full weight. He shook the snow from the coat and hung it near the door. Then he turned the lantern wick lower. He motioned to the hall, and the children went. Ben looked back. He opened his mouth the way he might when he meant to say something he had been thinking over. He closed it again. The hall took the two small bodies and their sounds. The cabin settled. The only noise left was fire breath and winter speech. Eli sat back on the stool and watched the girl's face, the way a person watches a sky they need. He did not count the seconds between her inhales and exhales, but he knew the rhythm. He waited until the color held. He set the cloth back in the kettle and let it sink. He rubbed his cold hands together once, then again, and felt the sting leave his knuckles. He did not look at the boots on the peg. He did not look at the letter on the spoon. He looked at the person who had knocked 3 times in a storm and made it this far. Maisie's voice came out from the dark in a whisper that traveled along the floorboards. "Will she stay?" Eli kept his eyes on the settle. He did not answer with a guess. He stirred the coals and watched how they held. He said only this: "This house keeps a fire. No one goes hungry here." The rest of it belonged to morning. Snow slid off the roof in a slow hush. A coyote barked at a distance that did not need to be minded. Inside, warmth drew a circle you could stand inside with both feet. Ben, in the dark of the hall, closed his hand over something small and hard in his pocket, a blue pebble he had found near the creek last summer. He squeezed it until his palm knew its shape again, then let go. The stranger slept. Morning thinned the storm into lace. Light sifted through the frost on the window panes and painted the floor in a pale wash. The coals in the hearth held a quiet red. The stranger's breathing had settled in the small hours and kept time with the tick in the stovepipe. She woke like someone coming up through water, her lashes stuck at the tips. She blinked at a ceiling of knotty pine, at a beam that held a horseshoe scar, at a ribbon of smoke stain that remembered other winters. A face appeared at the edge of the settle, close enough to blur, then sharpen. A girl with a tangle of blonde hair and a thumbprint of soot on one cheek rested her chin on the cushion. "Are you a witch?" The voice was serious and soft, as if a wrong answer could break something delicate. The woman's lips were dry. She shaped one word: "No." The girl nodded, like that made several things easier. "Maybe you are that kind of magic that keeps people warm." A heavier set of steps came from the hall. A boy with a square jaw for his age stood with his arms folded, not angry, only braced. He looked the stranger over as if she was a question on a slate. His hair stuck up where sleep had not yet let go. He did not speak first. Eli came from the stove with a wooden bowl and a spoon. Steam rose with the smell of chicken and thyme. He crouched beside the settle. "Sit up slow." He slid an arm behind the stranger's shoulders and raised her by inches. The blanket fell a little and he tugged it back to her collarbone. He set the bowl in her hands. "Take your time. Your stomach needs to remember how this works." She tried a small sip. Heat moved down into her and lit a place that had been dark. Her fingers shook. She held tighter to the bowl so it did not show. The spoon that Eli laid across the rim had a letter carved near the handle, rough under the thumb. The boy noticed the way her eyes touched the spoon. He reached without comment and set it more square. His hand was careful. He did not explain the letter. He did not have to. The girl, who must be the boy's sister, climbed onto her knees on the floor so she could be closer. "What is your name?" The woman swallowed. Her voice worked enough for one answer: Lila. The girl tried it out. "Lila, I am Maisie. That is Ben." She pointed at the boy. Ben gave a small nod that stayed almost a shake of the head. Lila lifted the spoon. Chicken soft and salted right, slid back into a body that had refused food for days. The room smelled of cedar, an iron stove, and the ghost of coffee grounds in a tin. The warmth hurt in a way she welcomed. She took another small spoon, then another, feeling the path open. Ben edged nearer. He had a bow across one shoulder, a rough thing he had made himself. The string looked tired. Lila glanced at it, then looked away. She set the bowl in her lap and wiped her thumb along a fray on the string. He watched her hand. She did not tell him what to do. She asked a question instead. "You get much snap?" He nodded once. "Sometimes." She pinched the fibers and twisted them between finger and thumb until they caught and lay tighter. "If you splice it like this, the tension holds. Harder to cut your fingers, too." She positioned his hands, turned them the way an older cousin might, in a barn where the light was bad. He followed the twist without a word. When he tested it, the string hummed clean. "Where did you learn that?" "An uncle. He hunted elk and did not like waste. I helped him in the evenings." Lila let her hands fall back to the bowl and lifted the spoon again. The food steadied her breathing. Eli stood and crossed to a peg near the door. He took down a pair of women's boots and came back with them cupped in his palms as if they might bruise. He set them beside the settle, leather cracked at the crease's soles still sound. These should not sit in the dark. They fit small. Lila's eyes moved from the boots to the spoon to the letter no one had named. She nodded to show she understood the shape of the gift. Her legs under the blanket felt like sticks, but she nudged one foot out and touched the boot toe to feel the leather. "Thank you." Eli returned to the stove, lifted the kettle, poured hot water into a plain cup that had been warming near the hearth. He set it on the small table within her reach and went still a moment as though listening to the room. He looked like the kind of man who counted that everyone had what his hands could provide and did not reach past that. Lila ate until the emptiness shifted into fullness that bordered on ache. She set the bowl aside and drew the blanket closer. The heat had brought feeling back to her fingers, and with it the sting of skin split by cold. She rubbed her hands together. There was a thing she had to say, and the saying of it would change the room. She looked at Ben and Maisie, then at Eli's back as he wiped the table with a cloth. The cloth moved in slow strokes that made the grain shine. Her voice came quiet but steady. "My last name is Merrick. The cloth stilled. Eli did not turn. Lila held the cup in both hands. Steam climbed past her face and fogged the edge of her vision. "Edwin Merrick was my father." Ben watched Eli. His shoulders rose and set. Lila kept her eyes on the cup. "He filed papers. He took land that was not his. Your land." She drew breath. She found some small spare honesty that hunger had not taken. "I am not my father, but he was mine." Silence opened a space where any answer could travel. The only sound was the small pop of a log turning in its own heat. Snow slid from the eaves in a long sigh. Eli set the cloth on the table and faced her. His expression did not rise or fall. He looked at Lila the way a man looks at weather that does not care what he thinks. "The man who did the taking is dead." He let the words rest there. "You are the one who knocked on my door in a storm." Lila's fingers tightened around the cup until her knuckles paled. "I can go if that is easier." Maisie set her palm on Lila's wrist and shook her head with the gravity of a child sworn to a secret. "Do not." Ben shifted his weight like a young tree testing wind. He did not speak. He stepped to the mantel, picked up the spoon, turned it once, then put it back where it had always belonged. He walked to the doorway and stood there, filling it, as if a door needed a person for its shape to make sense. Eli's gaze slid to the boots and back. He did not sigh. He looked at the girl his daughter had decided to touch, and at the boy who withheld words until they had work to do. He tipped his chin toward the cup. "Drink, then rest. We will see to the rest when the day is warmer." Lila nodded. She drank. The heat settled her. She could feel where her body began again. Maisie stayed near, as if proximity itself was a blanket. Ben tested the bowstring a second time. and allowed one corner of his mouth to lift a fraction. He slipped the bow back over his shoulder and went to fetch wood without being told. Eli lifted the latch and stepped outside to the lean-to. Cold walked in behind him and then relented when the door closed. Lila leaned back on the settle and watched the light crawl higher on the floorboards. It reached the shelf with the spoon, climbed the peg that held the boots, warmed the nick in the table edge where a knife had once lived, careless for a second. The room held. The fire held. The names held without being spoken. Ben returned with an armful of split pine. He set it by the hearth in a neat line. He paused by Lila and put something small on the settle near her hand, a pebble blue as creek ice worn smooth from pockets. He did not explain. He just looked at her and then away. For luck, he said, almost too quiet to hear. Lila closed her fingers over the stone. It was cool and real. She felt it take the heat from her skin and keep it. She let out a breath she had been holding since she said Merrick. Outside, the light found the ridge and lit the snow until it shone. Inside, the house smelled like broth and pine and a new cut of air. Eli came back through the door and brushed a drift from his hat with one finger. He looked at Lila as if measuring wind against kindling, then set another log on the fire. The room accepted the log and raised its small voice. The spoon caught the light. The boots waited on the floorboards for feet that could stand in them. The day opened, not generous, not mean, just open, and the three Rourkes and the stranger breathed inside it. By midday, the sky cleared to a hard blue that felt colder than the storm. Snow shone along the fence rails. The yard wore a skin of ice where the sun could not find it. Eli set fresh water for the horse. Ben split kindling into neat lengths and stacked them in a short wall by the door. Maisie traced fog hearts on the window and then erased them with her sleeve. Lila sat on the settle with the blanket to her waist and eased her feet into the small boots. The leather resisted, then softened with heat from her skin. She flexed her toes and felt the shape hold. The house smelled like broth and coffee gone warm. The spoon on the shelf caught a slice of light and gave it back. Ben stood at the table and tested the bowstring without looking at anyone. It made a clean sound. He let the bow hang from his shoulder and walked to the door. A horse came in at a walk, then stopped at the gate. The sound reached them in pieces. Tack breath, the small jingle of metal. Lila flinched, as if she knew the pattern before she heard it whole. Ben opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Eli moved past him and stood in the yard with his hands empty. The rider sat easy in the saddle. He wore a long coat that had taken sleet and dried stiff. His hat shadowed his eyes, but not his smile. He drew a folded paper from inside the coat and let it ride the wind. The page turned in the air and slapped the porch floor. Ben bent and picked it up. The ink bled at the edges. The print stayed clear enough. Wanted. Lila Merrick. Accomplice to estate conversion fraud. Reward on delivery. The rider watched Ben read it. Then he took in the open door and the small faces behind it. He spoke in a voice that tried to make business sound like law. You Eli Rourke. Eli did not look away. I am. Name is Silas Crow. I get paid to bring her in. Dead or alive is written right there. 25 to the hand that delivers. He gave the cabin a long look that felt like a hand sliding along a locked drawer. You can make this easier. Set her on the porch by sundown, and I'm gone before your stew cools. Ben stepped off the top step and onto the yard with the paper in his fist. His boots sank a little in the crust. She did not steal anything. The words came steady, not loud. He held Silas with his eyes. Silas laughed once. The sound had no mirth. That right. That what the child says. Eli shifted only enough to stand between Silas and the porch. His voice did not change weight. If you want to ride through here, do it and ride on. If you plan to come back for the person who knocked on my door in a storm, you can look me in the eye and say it plain. Silas adjusted the reins with one hand. He looked past Eli toward the well at the far edge of the yard, a circle of stones sunk in the snow. His gaze came back quick enough that only someone who avoided that view would notice. He dragged a gloved thumb along the saddle horn. Sundown tomorrow, 24 hours. He lifted his chin a fraction, then turned the horse with the pressure of a knee. The animal blew steam and set off at a casual trot that sent flecks of ice to the sides. The yard took the quiet the way a field takes wind. Ben unclenched his fist and passed the paper to Eli. Eli felt the weight of it and did not flinch at the words. He folded it once and once again until it hid itself in his palm. He put the folded square on the jamb where the door would shut over it like a lid. Lila had not moved from the settle. She watched Silas until the shape of him crossed the white of the pasture and then the darker line of the pines. She looked at the boots she wore, and then at Eli. Her voice came low. "I did not ask for this to follow me." Eli closed the door and set the bar. "You came in a storm. That is enough." Ben stood with his back to the door as if he could hold it with his spine. He looked from Lila to Eli, and then at Maisie, who had turned her face into Lila's blanket. Lila put a hand to the top of the child's hair and kept it there. Eli went to the hearth and banked the fire so it would last until evening. He straightened and scrubbed his hands on a towel in a hard way that said more than a curse. He faced the three of them and spoke as if the words had been waiting in his chest since Silas lifted his hand. "We cannot be here when he rides back." Ben nodded before the sentence finished. He looked around the room and saw it as a list of what could not come along. He took a breath through his nose and let it out slow. Eli saw the calculation and recognized it. Lila pulled the blanket aside and stood. Her legs shook once and then steadied. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the small blue stone. The cool gave her a point to hold. She kept her hand there. "If I leave alone, he gets what he came for." Her eyes moved to Maisie and back to Eli. "If I do not, he brings trouble to your door." Eli shook his head once. "The door already has trouble. Trouble is not what decides." He looked at the small pile by the hearth. He spoke to Ben without looking away from Lila. "The coats, the thick ones. Fill the canteen. Take the short rope and the flint. Leave the lanterns. Bring the little knife." Ben did not say that he had already chosen those things in his mind. He crossed the room and moved as he was told. He packed with care and speed that did not show panic. He kept his shoulders square. He put the blue pebble back in his own pocket and then took it out again. He glanced at Lila. She had one hand in her pocket already. He gave a quick quarter smile and left the stone with her by choice. Maisie lifted her face from the wool. She blinked strong. There was a wet line on her cheek she did not bother to wipe away. "Can we take the quilt?" Eli nodded. "One quilt, the blue one." Lila bent to lace the boots. The leather creaked and the laces bit. She tied with sure fingers. She stood again and tested balance. The room turned once and then stopped. The spoon on the shelf looked back at her. She reached up and touched the letter near the handle without taking it down. She did not say the name that went with it. She did not have to. Ben returned with coats and rope and a small wrapped bundle of biscuits from last night. He tucked the bundle deep so it would not tempt a hand too soon. He looked at Eli for the next instruction and found none. He lifted one coat to Lila. She pushed her arms through the sleeves and rolled her shoulders until the weight sat right. Eli checked the windows. He checked the latch on the back door. He crossed the room to the peg where the bonnet hung and did not reach for it. He stood in front of the boots on the floor for one extra breath and then looked away. He picked up the folded paper from the jam and pressed it flat on the table. He set a mug on it. The cup left a circle darkening the face printed there until the paper drank and blurred. The day had begun to lean. The light came lower through the windows and went gold across the churn and the chair and the line of kindling. Cold gathered in the corners in a way you could feel in your teeth. Eli lifted Maisie into her coat and buttoned it up to the throat with quick fingers. Ben slung the rope across his shoulder. Lila drew the blanket up and then folded it so the blue lay inside where it would stay clean. Eli took one more log from the stack and set it on the fire, though they would not be here to see it burn down. He stood still a moment and listened for a sound that did not belong. He heard only the horse in the lean to the kettle giving one last click the slow, small sleep of the house. He opened the door. Cold pressed in and took a piece of the warm. The four of them stood inside the threshold for a breath. Then they stepped out into the bright and the bite and the white that held every print like a new page. The house stayed behind them, with its spoon and its boots and its fire set to last longer than it needed. The yard opened to the ridge, and the ridge rose toward the trees. The well at the far edge sat in its ring of stone. Eli did not look at it. He closed the door and pulled the bar down on the outside so the wind could not play with it. He set his hand on the rail long enough to feel the sun in the wood. Then he let go. They took the slope behind the house where the wind had combed the snow into ripples. The gate clicked behind them. Eli set the pace along a line of fence posts that rose like teeth from the drift. Ben walked last with the rope coiled across his chest and the small knife at his belt. Lila kept a hand on Maisie until Eli lifted the girl and settled her high on his back. He crossed the straps and drew them tight. Maisie tucked her chin into his collar and breathed where the wool held warmth. The snow sounded different under each step. Eli made a slow crush. Ben made a sharp squeak. Lila made almost nothing. The air had that iron bite that makes lungs sting. Pines along the ridge shed a little powder with each gust. The sky was all hard blue and sun glare. Lila pulled the scarf higher and felt the coarse wool scratch her mouth. She tasted salt in the cloth, where sweat had frozen and thawed. The climb began to pinch. They cut across the face of the hill toward a stand of spruce. The shade there kept the snow clean and deep. Eli broke trail. Ben set his boots where Eli's boots had gone. Lila looked for the solid places and found them. The crust gave once and swallowed her to the knee. Eli stopped without turning. She pulled free and found her breath again. He moved on. They crossed a shallow draw where a creek slept under ice. The water made a low sound like something thinking. Eli tested the surface with the end of a stick and shook his head. He stepped through where the current had left a dark seam and the bottom rose near. Ben followed. Lila put her foot where the stick had lifted silt. Cold climbed to her shins inside the boots and bit the bones. She hissed between her teeth and kept moving. On the far bank, Eli knelt and tightened the straps that held Maisie. He looked at her face. The child's eyes were bright and a little glassy. He put his palm to her forehead and did not like what it found. "We will stop in the trees," he said, voice kept low by habit, not by fear. Ben nodded and looked at Lila once to see if she had heard. She had. She reached into her pocket and closed her hand around the blue pebble. It was so small. It felt like it belonged in a world no bigger than the space between finger and thumb. She held it until her skin warmed it and then let it go. A raven threw a call from a snag and flew. They moved under the shade where spruce held the wind like a thin sail. The smell of sap and cold dirt cut through the iron tang of the air. Lila touched the trunk of one tree as they passed. Her fingers came away with a tack of resin. Eli pointed with his chin. "There," he said, and they angled toward a low seam of rock set in the hillside. The opening did not look like a cave until they were on it. The drift had made a lip that hid the mouth. Eli kicked the snow down and cleared a slot with the heel of his boot. He ducked and went in sideways so the straps would not scrape. Lila came second, holding the rope for Ben. The dark took her sight for a moment. She smelled old dust at once. Cold, yes, but dry. Timber posts black with age lined the first few feet. An iron rail vanished under silt and straw. Someone had left a pickhead long years back, and the rust had eaten the eye. The roof sat low and steady. No drip, no fresh crack. "This will hold," Eli said. His breath made a small white wick in the dim. He eased to one knee and let Maisie slide down his side into his arms. He set her on Lila's quilt and put the quilt near the back where the rock broke the wind. Ben dropped the rope coil and began to gather chips and splinters where old boards had been cut to brace the walls. Lila tore a strip from the hem of her skirt and worked it in her hands until it softened. She pressed it to Maisie's forehead. The child shivered and clutched the edge of the quilt. Her lips had gone pale and she swallowed hard. Eli crouched near the opening and struck flint to steel. Sparks made brief stars. He did it again and again until one caught the tinder Ben had shaved. The flame came reluctant and then took. Eli fed it slow until there was a small, honest fire that would not throw smoke enough to talk to the sky. He set it where a low shelf of stone could bounce heat back. The light lifted the cave a notch. It made the timbers look like ribs. It found a nail driven high that had no hat on it anymore. Lila cradled Maisie and rocked a rhythm that did not need a tune. "Hush, small star, keep your fire," she said without thinking, the words old and plain on her tongue. She set the damp cloth and changed it when it cooled. She unbuttoned Maisie's coat with one hand and slid her palm against the girl's hot skin to share heat, not steal it. Ben took off his gloves and rubbed Maisie's back with careful circles. He did not look up. He hummed a line without a melody, only breath set to motion. Eli took the canteen and crouched at the mouth again. "There is melt along the draw," he said. "I will be quick." He went back out into the hard light and the bright cold. The cave breathed a little easier without the wind. Lila kept the cloth moving. Ben took a biscuit from the wrapped bundle and set it near the fire to soften. He waited for Lila to reach for it. She did not. She lifted it when he nudged it closer. She broke off a small piece and pressed it into Maisie's palm. The girl did not eat. Lila ate the piece and tasted flour and lard and a trace of honey like a memory. Ben shifted until his shoulder rested against Lila's arm. He stared at the flame as if it could tell him something that a person could not. He spoke without moving his mouth much. "Does the blue help?" Lila slipped 2 fingers into her pocket and touched the stone. "It helps me remember what feels like a good weight. That is enough." He nodded. He let out a slow breath. He sat like that until the flame drew a new line on the cave wall. Then he leaned in closer until his head found a place near Lila's shoulder. He said one word as if it had a shape he needed to test. Mama. The air changed. Not much. The fire hissed at a hidden sap pocket. Snow ticked at the mouth like grains poured from a sack. Lila did not show surprise. She set her cheek to the crown of his head and left it there. Yes, she said, the sound soft and real at once. Ben did not move for several blinks. He gave the smallest nod a person can give and still mean it. Eli came back with the canteen and hands red to the knuckle. He set the canteen near the fire and rubbed his fingers until the sting left. He looked at Ben. The boy looked different to a father who knows the tilt of a boy's head. Eli did not ask. He glanced at Lila. The look they exchanged held nothing fancy and no apology. He poured water into a tin cup and set it where the heat could take the chill off. He touched Maisie's hair with the back of his hand and listened to the sound her breath made. Ben took his bow apart in his lap and checked the splice Lila had shown him. He smiled where no one could see it. He put the bow back together and set it within reach. He pulled the quilt edge higher over Maisie and tucked it behind her shoulder. Lila began a low hum again, not a tune of church or town hall, one of those work songs a person uses to carry weight and count the steps. Eli fed a chip of wood to the fire. He spread his coat on the cave floor and sat on it. He faced the mouth in a way that did not look like fear. He could hear the ridge talk to itself in the wind. The light leaned out of the cave as the day went. Inside, the fire drew the walls closer. The smoke climbed the seam in the rock and left faint stain. The timbers held steady. Lila checked the cloth again. The heat on Maisie's skin began to lessen. The child turned once and tucked herself nearer the quilt fold. Ben's eyelids sank and rose and sank. He rested a hand on the edge of Lila's skirt as if fabric could anchor sleep. Eli's shoulders slowly let go of their high set. He lifted the cup and drank. The tin warmed his lip. Night came sure and absolute. The storm above the ridge softened its voice. It did not quit. It did not need to. The small fire found a quiet, red at the heart and a soft crumble at the edge. Eli lay on his side with one arm under his head. His eyes drifted and then opened and then drifted again. Lila kept upright until Maisie's breath found a child's rhythm. She eased back against the stone and felt the cool hold there. She slid the blue pebble from her pocket and set it near the fire where it took a little heat and shone like something wet. She touched it once and put it back. Ben whispered something in his sleep that did not have words. Lila smoothed his hair and felt the sweat at the nape where the cold had made him overheat. Eli turned his face toward the three of them and rested there. The cave held the sound of all their breathing. Outside, snow sifted over the drift that hid the mouth. A coal clicked and fell. The small bed of fire settled. Warmth made a circle no larger than a table enough for 4 people who needed it. Morning thinned to a cold brightness. The cave mouth wore a rime that caught light and made a small halo. The fire had settled to a red heart and a soft crumble at the edge. Maisie's forehead felt cooler under Lila's hand. Eli touched the stone seam above them and listened. The wind had changed its pitch. He nodded once. Time to move. They ate what was left of the biscuits in quiet. The crumbs stuck to dry lips. Lila folded the blue quilt and tied it with a strip from her skirt. Ben packed the rope so it would pay out smooth. Eli kicked a drift from the mouth and led them up into the white. The slope gave underfoot. Snow squeaked. Breath smoked. They angled for the stand of pines that stitched a dark line across the hill. The air had that iron taste again. Lila kept a hand on Maisie's back until Eli lifted the child and settled her behind his shoulders. The straps crossed clean. Maisie curled into the hollow where Eli's coat held heat. They cut through spruce shade and out into a lane of sun that ran between 2 low brows of land. The sky was a hard blue that kept its distance. The ridge to their left showed old cuts where someone had chased rock in a younger year. A rail half buried in drift made a sad angle. A raven threw its voice and flew. Ben walked last and watched their trail fill in behind them. The wind loved clean pages. They came on the clearing quick because the snow lay shallow there. It was a neat circle scoured by wind ringed with young pines, and in the center sat a round of stone no taller than a barrel. Moss clung to the north side. A low storm fence leaned half-made to one side as if someone had started a chore and never finished. Lila thought it looked like a place meant for a long drink and a longer rest. Eli looked once and went past without saying. The look he gave was the kind you give a piece of ground that holds an old story. Lila did not know the story. She set the quilt near a sun patch where the wind did not bite so hard. She pulled off her gloves and flexed her fingers. They hurt and came back. She broke a small heel of bread and crumbled it for Maisie. The child smiled at the warm place and slid off Eli's back with slow care. She sat on the quilt and picked at the crumbs with 2 fingers. Ben and Eli moved into the trees for wood. The sound of their steps fell and rose. The clearing kept a hush the way some churches do on a weekday. Lila looked toward the pines. The light had that winter slant that makes everything seem just a little farther away. She checked Maisie, then turned to arrange the blanket for shade. It happened in a breath, a soft scuff, a small gasp that did not belong to a game. Lila turned. Maisie had stepped to the ring of stone. Her left boot had slid on a rim crusted with frost. Her hands shot out and caught the edge. Her legs went down into the circle. The sound that came out of her throat was not a scream at first. It was a broken call for a familiar person. Mama. Lila was moving before thought. The rope lay in Ben's pack by the pines. Eli's back was to them, bent to a fallen limb. The distance to that pack and back was measured in heartbeats she could not spare. She dropped the bread, dropped the gloves, and went to the well. She hit the stones with both hands and felt the cold settle into her skin like a claim. Moss slicked the inside. There were old chisel marks under the slime that made uneven holds. She braced her weight and reached. Maisie's fingers were white knuckles like small stones. Lila caught one wrist and then the other. I have you. Breathe. She could not pull the child all the way. The lip chewed at the girl's coat, and the slick gave no purchase. Lila put her knee over the edge. The chill went through to bone. Do not look down, she told herself, and looked down anyway to find where she could put her feet. She swung one leg inside and felt for a place. Her boot found a notch. Her other boot found a ledge that crumbled but held. The world narrowed to stone, breath, small hands. She slid inside the circle and set her back against the wall. The cold there took the breath from her and then gave it back. She eased Maisie down until the child's feet found the top of her boot. I have you. We are in a dry throat. That is all. She did not lie. There was no water below, only shadow and the faint smell of rock that had once been wet. Eli straightened with the limb in his hands and heard the sound Lila had made. He dropped the wood and ran. Ben ran with him faster than a boy could run on ice if he was not thinking. They saw Lila's hair at the circle of stone and the small hands clamped white to the rim. Eli reached the edge and went flat to his chest without a word. Lila looked up and met his eyes. Her hair stuck in a fringe to her forehead. Her lips had a split in the middle. She did not ask for help. She placed the child's weight in his hands as if passing a sleeping lamb. Hold her with both, Lila said. Eli did. He took Maisie by the elbows and lifted. He said nothing to the child. He spoke to the bone and muscle of lifting. Ben had the rope uncoiled now. He threaded it under his father's shoulder and around a post that leaned close. He nodded fast and clean. Maisie slid over the rim and into Eli's arms, with a small sound that was half cry, half breath being found again. He wrapped her and set her on the quilt. Ben fell to his knees beside her and put his palm to her cheek as if to prove she weighed what he remembered. Lila looked up at the circle of sky and saw Eli move back to the edge. She could not see Ben. She could hear him. The rope came down, a sound that is part scrape, part soft fall. It brushed her shoulder. She tied it under her arms with sure fingers that did not shake until the knot was set. She tested with her weight. The rope held. She pushed with her boots and felt the wall give little kisses of grit that would leave dark smudges on her stockings. The climb was slow because the body waits for fear and then moves anyway. Eli braced and took the pull. Ben planted both feet and leaned his weight into the line like a second small anchor. Lila rose hand to hand, a foot and then a foot. Her elbows burned. The stone chewed at her palm. A fleck of moss came loose and fell past her ear into the black. She set her teeth and moved. When her hands reached the rim, Eli caught her under the arms and lifted. She came over and lay on the snow on her back, looking up at the sky like it might speak. The cold wrapped her. Breath came in short fits and then evened. Eli stayed on his knees, hands still on her arms. His face looked different, like the skin had gone one size smaller. You could have broken your neck. There was no anger in it. Lila turned her head to see Maisie. The child had crawled across the quilt and put her whole small body against Lila's side. Lila set her hand on the girl's back. She did not let it shake. I have been in darker places, she said. She managed a small smile that had nothing to do with teeth. Now I know someone will pull me up. Ben let go of the rope and sat down hard in the snow. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist and left a line of streaked grit across his cheek. He gave Lila a look that held three things at once: fear that had not finished leaving, relief that had not finished arriving, respect that had arrived first. Eli stood and tested his own legs. He looked at the ring of stone as if it were a person who had entered a room without knocking. He took 2 steps and kicked snow into the opening until the rim went white. He lifted the half-made fence and dragged a crosspiece onto the circle. The wood was light with age, but it would make a poor invitation. He set a rock on the crosspiece and waited. Maisie made the small hiccup sound of a child who is done crying. Lila pulled her close and pressed her lips to the warm place where neck meets shoulder. Ben brought the canteen. Lila drank, then tipped a little onto a corner of her scarf and wiped grit from Maisie's hands, then from her own. The skin on her palm was cut in 2 places. The blood came slow because cold makes small gates of veins. The sting told her she was alive in a way that sleep does not. They moved to the edge of the clearing and built a small fire against a low rock. Eli used chips and thin sticks so the smoke would be meaner to the air and kinder to the eyes. The flame took and crouched. Lila held her hands near and felt the pain change to warmth. Ben sat close enough to feel his shoulder touch Lila's arm. He did not move away. Eli stared into the fire, then let his gaze go to the well. He spoke as if he was talking to the stone and not to them. It was 3 winters back. Snow sat on the rim. The wind blew from the north, so the drift lay wrong. Clara walked out to hang a line because the light had opened and the day lied. He stopped. He did not go on right away. He scraped a chip of sap from a stick with his thumbnail and flicked it into the fire. It jumped. Lila did not speak. She looked at the boots she wore. She looked at the spoon in her mind. She set her hand over Eli's for 1 breath and then left it there 1 breath longer. "I am sorry," she said. It was simple and adequate. Eli nodded once. "So was I," he said, and his voice was not tired, only plain, for a long time. Snow settled on the crosspiece over the well and made a soft cap. The fire put a faint varnish of heat on their faces. Maisie slid toward sleep and curled into Lila as if her body had filed new instructions. Ben watched the flames work. He looked at the rope and then at the circle of stone and then back at the people around the fire. He leaned in until he could feel the slow draw and release of breath at Lila's side. The clearing stood quiet. The wind braided the tops of the pines. The heat held within the small radius that 4 people could share. The well did not look like a mouth anymore. It looked like a place a person had met and answered. They sat a while longer by the small fire in the clearing. When the flames settled to a quiet bed, Eli went to the horse to check the cinch and the bags. His hand paused at the near saddle. Something pale stuck from under the strap, stiff as bark. He drew it free. An envelope cream sealed with a pressed mark that had caught a bit of grit. The wax held an M inside a wreath. Eli turned the thing in his fingers as if it might be a trick. He brought it back and held it out. Lila looked at the seal and did not touch it right away. Her thumb brushed the edge. She broke the wax clean and slid out a folded sheet. The paper had the courthouse smell of ink and shelves and a clerk's wet rag. She read in a voice that was barely more than breath. By order of Probate La Plata County, Miss Lila Merrick, heir to the Merrick estate, is to receive the ivory comb registered as family property. Item to be claimed at Wexler's General in Prospect Falls. She let the words settle, then folded the paper exactly along its crease. She left it in her palm and looked at Eli. The air between them did not ask. It only held the moment. "Where did it come from?" Ben asked. "Under the strap," Eli said. "Someone had a hand near our horse and I did not see it." Maisie traced the seal with a fingertip. The wax had already cracked. "Is it for hair?" she asked. "It is a comb," Lila said. She looked toward the line of trees that pointed the way to town. Her voice stayed even. "I need to go into Prospect Falls." Ben glanced toward the open cut of sky beyond the pines, then toward the road that bent behind the ridge. Lila looked at him and shook her head once. "I go myself," she said. "I will be quicker." Eli did not argue inside words. He gave one small nod. He reached into the bag and pulled free a plain shawl the color of wool before dye. He shook off a kernel of grit and handed it to her. He spoke with care. "Do not make it a long visit." She wrapped the shawl, tied it across her chest, and rose. The boots felt like they had been waiting for this walk since they were made. She tucked the probate letter into her bodice and felt the paper sit cool against her skin. She touched the blue stone in her pocket for a count of 3 and let it go. Then she took the line that cut toward the town, a wide arc where snow had thinned to churned slush under wagon wheels. Prospect Falls did not hide its watching. Windows along Main showed people at the edges, hands paused in whatever they were doing. A man in an apron leaned in a doorway and studied his boots. A girl in a shawl stopped sweeping and held the straw off the ground. The street made a soft, wet clatter under hooves and shoes. Lila walked through it with her head level. The church bell had no reason to ring. A dog scratched and lay down in the wedge of sun that reached between two false fronts. Someone laughed too loud and stopped quick. The sign over the general store said Wexler's in letters that had been repainted twice. The bell above the door gave a small ring that settled right away. Inside smelled like flower lamp oil rope and peppermint sticks in a glass jar. The plank floor had dips where many feet had turned. Wexler came forward, wiping his hands on a rag that had known better days. He wore spectacles that had slipped down at his nose to where they could be useful. "Well now," he said. "Miss Merrick." He let the name hang in the air like a test weight. "Thought you were gone." Lila did not pick that up. "I am here for an item," she said. "Heirloom." The court sent word. Wexler nodded as if the whole thing made a circle he understood. He bent and pulled a velvet pouch from under the counter. He set it down with a careful hand. He worked the drawstring and lifted out a comb ivory polished to a faint sheen like old teeth. Someone had carved a vine along the spine, and at one end a small set of initials, E.M., that had never been worn smooth. Wexler held it so the letters showed. He cleared his throat. "I suppose we could add the rest of your name if you plan to keep it as is." He gestured toward a small card that gave the cost for engraving. Lila put her hand out and took the comb. The weight was nothing. The cold of it surprised her. She turned it once. The light came through thin places and made it glow. She could see the scratches where a hand had used it in rooms she had not stood in. She looked at the initials and felt the old pull inside the letters. Then she lifted the comb in both hands and brought it down against the counter. The snap was clean and true. It sounded like thin ice breaking. The room drew in breath. The comb lay in two pieces on the scarred plank, one half with the letters, one with the vine that now led nowhere. Lila left them there. She did not look at Wexler for permission or pity. "I do not need that name to know who I am," she said. The words were low and steady. Her face did not change. Wexler blinked. He seemed to see a great deal and choose to speak only a little. He gathered the halves as if they might cut someone and set them in the velvet pouch. His mouth worked once. "The court will want to note that you claim the item," he said. He slid a ledger toward her and turned it. There was a column for signature. There was a column for remarks. Lila wrote Lila and left the family line empty. In the remarks she wrote one word, claimed. The bell rang when she left. Outside, the air had turned sharp. A paper on the post near the door moved with the wind. She glanced without meaning to. Her face stared back in rough print, her name written large as if more ink made more truth. The reward line sat neat and clear. Someone had drawn a small hat on the printed head with a bit of graphite, a child's mischief left by a hand that was bored. Lila did not flinch. She stepped into the street. At the far end of Main, a livery stood with its doors open and no horse inside. A sign leaned against the frame, for lease in thin letters that had been brushed on after closing time. One stall door hung straight. The next door had a broken hinge that made the lower corner kiss the plank. A faint smell of old hay came and went on the air. Lila looked a moment. The corners of her mouth moved like someone thinking about how a room might feel with light in it. Then she went on. Back at the edge of town, the road bent to find the hills. The snow there sat cooler, less churn. Her feet found their own pace between prints that had been made by a man in a coat and a boy in boots, smaller by 2 sizes. She followed those. At the stand of trees, she saw Eli first. He sat his heels on a low rock and watched the place where the road showed. Ben stood with one hand on the horse's neck. Maisie had the blue quilt around her shoulders and a scrap of bread in her fist. Lila walked into the little circle they made without saying what had happened. She did not need to. Her hands gave it away. No comb, no bag, no paper except the folded probate letter that she took from her bodice and tore in 4 pieces before anyone could tell her not to. She touched Eli's sleeve a small touch more, a way to steady a thought than a body. He lifted his look and let it rest on her face, then at her fingers, then back to her face. "Did you get what you came for?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She slid the scrap of court seal into her pocket with the blue stone and felt the different edges. One piece was slick with wax, one was smooth with creak. Ben searched her eyes as if they were a field he knew. He made a sound in his throat that was almost a laugh, then quieted. Eli rose. He did not ask for the object or a story he did not need. He adjusted the horse's strap so it would not bite. Maisie stepped to Lila and looked up. Lila reached down and brushed a crumb from the child's chin with her thumb. The wind moved through the tops of the pines and sounded like sleeves rubbing. Somewhere a hammer struck iron on iron and left a sharp ring that faded quick. They set out from the trees and took the line back toward the ridge. Snow made a new skin where their earlier prints had gone under. The light slid along the bark and across Lila's shoulder. She put her hands in her pockets and felt the stone take her warmth and give back something that was not heat, not exactly. The road rose a little and then leveled. The day stayed cool and honest. The four of them moved in the white and the blue and the smell of spruce and smoke that clung to their clothes. Rain came thin and steady, a fine silver that made the streets shine and the dust turned to paste. Prospect Falls smelled like wet wood and horses and bread that did not exist yet. The chapel stood with its paint lifting at the corners. Lila stood under the eave and tacked a scrap of parchment beside the door with a bent nail she had straightened on a stone. Baking lessons for anyone with flower fire and heart. Ask for Lila. The words tilted a little because the paper had taken rain. She pressed the corners flat with the heel of her hand. The bell line above her made a low hum in the breeze. Across the way, a girl paused with a broom and pretended she was fixing a knot in the straw. Two men at the blacksmith leaned, spoke soft, and looked away when Lila raised her head. The livery that had shown Forlease now held a different smell. She had aired it for 2 days, swept the straw to the stalls, pried open a window that had taken a set, and scrubbed the plank counter with sand until old grime came up like a secret. She dragged in a work table from behind Wexler's with his permission, and his shrug carried by Ben at one end and Eli at the other. She set 2 Dutch ovens near the brick she had bricked by hand into a square that would hold a fire. She hung a length of twine between 2 nails and clipped her apron there with clothespins that still smelled of spring. The first day no one came. Lila measured anyway, hands steady eyes on the bowl, a small talk of water into flour that made a sound like dry ground drinking. The dough pulled together with salt and a touch of honey. She kneaded until her shoulders warmed and the heel of her hand found rhythm. The oven took the heat slow. Smoke curled and cleared. She baked 2 loaves and donated them to the orphanage on the ridge where a woman named Sister Leonie said little and took the bread like a person who knows what it can do. On the second day, 2 women appeared at the livery door. They stood half and half out as if the threshold had a temper. One had a shawl wrapped twice around a thin frame and lips that had forgotten how to soften. The other had a scarf tied hard under her chin and hands that showed work in each knuckle. The first spoke without smile. "We came to watch, not to learn." Lila nodded, as if that was a kind thing to offer. "There is a bench by the window. It is warm there." She did not ask their names. Names come easier when a person is busy. They sat and did not take off their shawls. Lila set bowls on the table and tied on her apron. Her hair slipped from its knot because the air smelled like wet rope and heat. She poured flour into a mound that looked like a small hill. She made a well with her fingers and tipped water into the center. She talked to the dough as if it could hear. A little more. Not yet. Now. The women watched for a while with their mouths set hard. The smell began to work on them. It left a note of warmth at the back of the nose that slid down and found a place to sit in the chest. Lila pushed the dough and folded it over itself. She held it up so the 2 women could see the stretch and the way the surface changed when it was ready to rest. One woman came forward without meaning to. She put a hand on the edge of the table. She nodded once. "If you want your bread to forgive you," Lila said, "keep your hands kind." She smiled the smallest smile. The woman with the tied scarf reached out and put her fingers in the dough as if a thing could break if she was rude to it. The other woman followed. They worked the dough with short economical movements that belonged to people who had never had the chance to be fussy. Lila watched their hands until she could step back without them noticing. Children began to gather where the rain made a fringe off the roof. They smelled sugar that was not there and cinnamon that had not been opened. They came from the orphan ridge and from houses that did not keep sweets in jars. A boy with no hat put his fingers on the sill and watched like a cat at a fish barrel. Lila looked up and nodded him inside. Sister Leonie appeared in the doorway and said nothing, then took a seat at the back and folded her hands. Her eyes softened at the corners. The oven got to talking, that soft, steady hiss that says heat is where it needs to be. A pan of biscuits went in with a brush of butter and a sprinkle of sugar as fine as dust. Lila checked the heat by hand and by ear because not every lesson belongs to a book. She moved through the room without haste. If a child stood too close, she pressed 2 fingers to a shoulder, and the child moved not because of words, but because of the way a person can set a line in the air. Eli came near sundown, tall in the doorway with rain on his hat brim. He took in the room and the faces and the steam that had come to sit near the ceiling. He looked down at his shirt as if it had become a poor excuse. Lila held up an apron that had once been blue and tied it behind his back. The strings did not meet without a small tug. Ben looked and did not smile enough to be rude. Maisie stood on a crate beside the table. Her hair had found every piece of damp and made curls of it. She pointed and announced what Eli had already learned. "There is dough in your beard." He wiped at his chin with the back of his wrist and found a smear of flour there. He chuckled without intending to. It made a sound the room liked. Lila put a bowl under Eli's hand and dropped a measure of flour into it. "No speech," as she said. "Stir. If it clumps, we make it again." He did as he was told, because work is easier than talk in a room that smells like this. He stirred and learned the weight you want when water and flour are right. He learned to feel with the spoon and not only with the arm. He burned a pan of biscuits and held his hands up to admit it. Lila did not scold. She held up the blackened rounds in a tin and tapped the lid. "These go to the jar that keeps a man honest." The 2 women who had come to watch and not learn laughed. The sound surprised them. They covered their mouths and then let their hands drop. Their dough rose good and clean. They held it up and showed each other like a pair of girls, and the shawls slid a little off their shoulders. Ben took time at the back of the room, then came to Lila with a bundle wrapped in soft leather and tied with twine. He kept his chin down while he offered it. "For you," he said. He did not lift his eyes. She untied the twine and folded the leather back. Inside lay a small notebook he had made. The stitches were straight. The covers had been cut from something that had once been a saddlebag. Inside he had drawn loaves, 1 round, 1 long. He had written in a hand that was learning to be sure. Times, temperatures, notes about coals and where to put your hand to read heat. In the center was a page with a title that was almost too much for a boy to write. "Why Lila Belongs Here." She read the lines without showing the motion in her throat. Maisie sleeps better when she sings. Eli sits different when she talks. She fixes things, even the ones we did not know were broken. A crumb of flour stuck to the page where his finger had rested too long while the ink dried. Lila pressed the book to her chest and felt the edge of the paper against the bone. She did not say thank you. She put her hand on Ben's head a moment and then let it go. He breathed out and stood taller by a small degree you could not measure with a line. The biscuits came out of the oven with their tops split and their bottoms brown where heat had kissed them. Lila opened a jar of honey that had waited behind Sister Leonie's pantry for a day like this. The smell lifted and turned the room toward it. She passed a plate down the line and made sure each small hand got a piece with a shine. The last piece went to Eli. He broke it in 2 and handed half to Lila. She took it and stood with him beside the door while the room talked around them. Rain tapped faster on the roof and then eased. Light shifted on the floorboards as the sun thought about leaving. The livery walls held all the breaths and laughs and small words people say when the work of their hands gives them something more than food. Lila leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. Eli stood so close his sleeve brushed her sleeve when he breathed. He spoke without making a promise bigger than the room could hold. "I cannot promise more than what I can hold in my hands," he said. His voice was low, meant for her in the wood. "I can promise this. I choose you today. If tomorrow comes and I have the choice again, I will choose you again." Lila did not answer with a speech. She set the honey piece in his palm, closed his fingers, and placed his hand against her heart where the notebook had rested. The print of flour on his knuckle made a faint mark on her dress. She kept his hand there for the count of a breath. Then she stepped back and turned to the room and wiped a smear of butter from Maisie's chin with the corner of her apron. Rows of loaves cooled on the sill. Steam made their tops shine. The air held cinnamon and ash and the clean scent of rain running off new wood. The 2 widows rolled up their sleeves and cleared the table without being told. Children licked their fingers and brought plates to the tub. Sister Leonie lifted a boy's hand and checked that he had all his fingers, which he did, because the knife had stayed where Lila put it. When it was done, when the last bowl sat drying on the rack, and the fire in the brick square had folded into a bed of calm red, Eli untied the apron at his back and hung it on the twine. He stood in the doorway and looked out at Main Street. The wanted paper on the post flapped twice and went still. He did not move his eyes that way. Lila took the broom and swept flour from the cracks in the plank. The bristles made a soft sound. Ben gathered the notebooks and stacked them with care. Maisie yawned a yawn that opened her whole small face. The room glowed tight and low. The heat held. The smell of honey clung to their sleeves. Lila slid the stitched book into her pocket, where the blue pebble also lived. Paper and stone made different weights. Both felt right. She blew out one lamp and then the other. The last light came from the embers. It was enough to walk by. It was enough to close up and step into the evening with something warm in their hands that would not last long and did not need to. Morning came thin and bright, bright enough to make the frost on the rails look like sugar. The yard held stillness that felt like a held breath. Ben stood on the top rung of the fence with a hammer in one hand and a plank under his arm. The old sign hung from 2 screws above the gate. Rourke Homestead letters worn to a pale brown. He braced his feet and set the claw to the first screw. Metal squealed a little. The screw gave. He pocketed it and leaned in for the second. A coyote called from the draw and stopped. His breath smoked and then disappeared. The second screw came loose with a small snap. The sign rocked in his hand. He passed it down to the ground and set it upright against the fence. He looked at it for a long count, then at the empty span above the gate. Eli that came from the lean-to with a tin cup and a knife he used for everything that did not need a sharp one. He stopped when he saw Ben on the fence. He took the scene in without moving his face much. He set the cup on the fence post and waited. Ben lifted the new plank to his knee and checked the grain. It had a knot near one end and a clean run in the middle. He pulled the small pocket knife from his belt, tested the edge on his thumb pad, and set the tip into the wood. He carved the first line slow, letting the knife walk the curve. The cut made a soft whisk sound and threw a curl that fell to his boot. "What are you putting?" Eli asked. Ben did not stall. He spoke around the work so the letters would not go crooked. The stone fields. He carved T, careful not to run the cross too long. The knife slipped once and scored where the S would go. He breathed and adjusted. The wood gave off a faint sweet that smelled like sap and dust, and last summer. He wiped his nose on his sleeve and went on. Lila came from the house with 2 mugs cupped in both hands. Steam turned the air above them to soft clouds. Her hair was tied back in a practical knot and had already escaped. She passed a mug to Eli and stood with her hip against the fence to watch. She blew on the surface, took a sip, and set the mug on the post near Eli's. Ben made the O deep and round so weather could not erase it in a season. The knife worked a rhythm. Lift, turn, press, pull. Curls of wood gathered on his boots and the rail. They looked like little peelings of butter. Maisie patted out in a too big sweater that had been meant for someone else. She carried a tin of nails like it was a treasure box and set it near Ben's foot. "What is it going to say?" she asked. Ben did not answer until he had finished the end that wanted to lean. He squinted and straightened it with 2 small cuts. He spoke without looking down. "Stone fields. Because we have stones and we have fields." She nodded as if that explained at least 5 other things. She put both hands on the old sign that leaned there and traced the letters that had been there since before she could read. Her finger paused on the R. She looked up at Eli. "Do we need to keep this one too?" Eli put a hand on the old plank as if touching a shoulder. He did not move it. He looked at Ben on the fence at the careful way the boy set his knife to wood. He looked at Lila, who stood with her hand tucked into her coat pocket, where a pebble might be. His mouth softened at the corners. "We are not throwing it in the creek," he said. "We can lean it behind the shed. Let the chickens read it when they get lonely." Maisie laughed a little and pressed her nose into the sweater neck until it bunched at her chin. Lila smiled into her mug and did not hide it. She watched Ben cut the E and made herself breathe slow so she would not say where to put the lines. The light found sawdust and made it gold. Ben reached the F and made it too narrow. He fixed it by cutting the crossbar twice and stepping back to C. He set the knife aside and ran a thumb through each letter to lift the rough. Splinters pricked his skin. He sucked the pad of his thumb and tasted sap. He wiped his hands on his trousers and picked up Eli's knife. The bigger blade planed the edges smoother. The word began to look like itself. Eli took a swallow of coffee and set the cup down. He walked to the gate and lifted the new plank. He held it up to the empty place and felt the weight. It was not heavy, but it asked for care. Ben climbed down and took the other end. They set the sign on the top rail and marked where the screws would go. Eli drilled pilot holes with the tip of the knife because there was no drill. The sound was soft, like a bug chewing a leaf. Ben set the screws. The first one bit and turned. The second stuck, then caught. He felt that catch through the handle. He tightened until the board set home. They both stepped back. The letters were not all the same size. The S leaned a touch. The field part looked like it wanted to run. The whole read true. Eli put his hand flat on the word. The grain lifted under his palm. He pressed until he could feel warmth pass. He did not say that it felt right. He did not need to. Lila climbed one rail up and reached with 2 fingers to trace the O. The cut was clean and only a little furry where the knife had tired. She let her fingertips rest there and then set her palm flat the way Eli had. She stood like that long enough to feel the light in the wood. "What does a name do?" Maisie asked. Her voice came from the level of the rails where she had crouched to pick up curls of wood and make little nests for pretend mice. Ben answered from the fence with the certainty of someone who had been thinking on it for days. "It makes a place stand up and be counted." He jumped down and gathered the curls into his hands. He shook them into the wind, and they flew like pale moths. Lila brushed dust from her palms. She looked at the old sign that leaned polite against the fence. She set it upright and carried it with both hands to the side of the shed where the rain did not reach. She leaned it there and stepped back. She wiped the edge with her sleeve, then left it alone. Eli pulled his hat brim down to shade his eyes and studied the yard through the new word. The barn looked like the same barn. The corral looked like the same corral. The space between them had a slight change, a tilt toward belonging that had not stood there yesterday. He let his shoulders ease. Ben hammered one more nail into the left corner because a thing likes to know it will not rise on a wind. The nail head flashed once and went dull. He tested the board with both hands and found no give. He looked at Lila and did not say anything that would make him sound too proud. She saw it anyway. Maisie reached up and touched the S with the tip of her mitten. Her hand came away with a whisper of grain. She stuck the mitten to her nose and sniffed with seriousness. "It smells like a pencil." Lila laughed, a small sound that made the morning friendlier. She took her hand from her pocket and showed her palm. The blue pebble sat there. She lifted it to the letter O and held it for a second inside the round. The fit pleased her because it meant nothing and everything. She closed her fingers and slipped the stone back where it lived. She pressed her palm to the wood once more. Ben stepped to the outer gate and swung it open and shut. The hinges complained the same way they always had. The latch caught. The sound made a note he had heard his whole life and would hear again many times. He nodded to himself and to the sign. Eli lifted the old board a last time and set it on 2 nails in the shed wall. The chickens clucked and bobbed and pretended to read. He came back to the gate and stood with Lila under the arch of their work. The sun had climbed enough to turn the frost to wet at the edges. Drops fell and darkened the rail one by one. Ben picked up the tin of nails and the pocket knife and tucked them in the box on the porch where tools go to rest. Maisie patted the rail and told it not to worry when the wind came. Lila took the empty mugs and balanced them in one hand. Eli brushed sawdust from his coat and let his fingers fall to his sides. The sign held the light and gave some back. The name looked simple. It would read right in rain or in sun, or with a skin of snow on the crossbars. It would stand there when the yard was quiet and when it was not. The 4 of them looked up at it together, and then went about the morning, the smell of cut wood still on their sleeves. Prospect Falls dressed itself with light. Lanterns hung from fence to fence across the square and made a soft roof of warm circles. The air held a mix of cold and cinnamon, of damp wool and split pine. A banner swung over the boardwalk, letters brushed by a careful hand. "Unnaming Day. Come as you are. Leave as you choose." Lila carried a basket to the table near the chapel. Steam slipped through the weave and vanished in the chill. She set out honey biscuits that still held the shine, a round loaf with a split top, and a plate of sugared scraps that would not last long. Wexler straightened the banner one more time and pretended the wind had done the work. Elsie and Mag arrived with sleeves rolled and cheeks bright from the brisk walk. Sister Leonie led a line of children down from the ridge, their collars buttoned to the throat, their eyes already up where the lanterns waited. Ben came ahead and placed a small tin bucket at the corner of the well. He set chalk inside white and blue and yellow. He stepped back and rubbed the dust from his fingers into his trousers. The well sat like an old promise in the center of the square ringstones scrubbed by time and weather. Someone had wrapped a new rope guard around the rim. It looked less like a mouth and more like a table that had not been set. Maisie found the chalk first. She stood on her toes and picked the yellow as if it had been calling her by name. Wexler rolled out a slate board on a crate. The chalk squeaked once before it learned the path. Maisie pressed her lips together the way she did when the work mattered. She wrote big, careful letters that looked like a small parade, honey drop. When she stepped back, she looked at Lila with a seriousness that lived in her small bones. Because muffins are soft in the middle, she said. Lila nodded and touched the top of her head. More boards went up across the square. Names that had been built by other people began to loosen. Men with bent backs and women with hands like bark stood in front of clean slates and tried out a letter or two before they committed. Elsie printed a name that belonged to the girl she remembered under the shawl. Mag wrote the first half, and then laughed, and wrote the second. The blacksmith, apron still on, signed a word that fit him better than Smith. He wiped his hand on his apron and left a dark mark on his new letters that would not come off and did not need to. Ben waited until other boards filled. He stepped to the slate and wrote without racing. Ben, the keeper. He dotted nothing. He let the period carry the weight. Sister Leonie saw it and made a sound in her throat that was almost a song. Lila stood with her hands inside her coat pockets and watched the chalk move across a dozen boards. The blue pebble warmed under her fingers. She pulled one hand free and let it hang. She stepped to a board and held the chalk a second. The night around her held steady and waited the way a room does when a child is asleep and no one wants to wake the air. She pressed the chalk down. Lila Stonefield, not by blood, by choice. No one clapped. The square did not need a noise. A wind went down the lane and raised the banner to a higher billow. It came back to a rest. Eli was not there yet. The place he would stand was a small absence near the post where the wanted paper had once lived. It now held a notice for seed and a warning about wolves near the North Range. Lila turned and poured cider for two boys who pretended they were not thirsty. She wiped a smear of honey from Maisie's cheek. She made sure Sister Leonie had a plate that would not fall through the smallest hunger. When Eli came, he came with both hands in front of him, careful. In those hands sat a wooden cage that had once held kindling. Inside the old hen Lila had pulled from the ice one bitter afternoon, fluffed and clucked, and hit the slats with her beak. Eli had tied a small sign to the cage with twine. It was a pale scrap of board with words cut by a pocket knife. For the one who stayed, for the name we chose. He set the cage on the well's rim. The hen settled like a creature who knows an audience when she hears one. People shifted and made room. Lila moved through the small gap and laid her palm flat on the sign. Her fingers gathered a little sawdust. She lifted her eyes to Eli's face and left her hand where it was. He stood, plain coat, clean hair wet from where he had brushed it back, in a trough. The corner of his mouth changed by as much as it ever did in public. The lanterns took hold of the evening. Children carried candles to the circle around the well. Wexler passed them out with care, lit each wick from a starter flame he kept under his hat like a joke he was proud of. Sister Leonie cupped Maisie's small hands around a match, then guided the light to a candle that had already begun to lean. The well lit in pieces, then all at once a ring of small suns that made the stone look young. One by one, people stepped forward and spoke names close enough to the rim that the drop could hear and keep them. They did not shout. They did not announce. They let the stone take the sound. Elsie put a hand flat on the rim and whispered something that made her shoulders come down. Mag laughed at her own new word and wiped a tear away without covering the smile. The blacksmith bowed his head as if at a doorway and let his name fall down to the bottom where the rope used to hang. Ben held his board at his side. He did not kneel. He stood square and said his name the way you say when you have gotten strong enough to carry it. The Keeper. The ring of candles caught the lines of his face and made him look older and a little happier. Maisie, whose letters were already work, held her board up at the edge of the light. She put her mouth right to the stone and sent honey drop into the old places. She nodded to herself as if now the world understood. Lila waited. She watched the light pool and slide on faces she knew, and faces she only saw when they needed flour or nails. She stepped to the rim, reached into her pocket, and touched the pebble once. She did not lift it out. She kept it there as if some names do their work in the dark. She set her fingers on the rope guard and leaned in enough that the light lifted on her cheekbone. Lila Stonefield. She said not by blood, by choice. The words went down and did not come back. That was all right. Names are not echoes. Eli had not come to the rim yet. He stood back a step and watched the lanterns lace the air into a roof. He picked up the tacked sign on the cage and ran a thumb once along the cut letters. He looked up and found Lila in the light. He did not step closer right away. When he did, he had no speech ready. He set his hand at her elbow for a breath and then let it fall. He did not need to say what he had already said in a quieter room. Wexler raised a hand, the way a man who does not often lead a crowd will do when it is his turn to be tall. He gestured to the children. They began to pass a basket with small slips of paper for those who wanted the writing to follow the saying. Sister Leonie whispered to a boy who had written his name backward. He looked at it, turned the paper in his hands, and smiled as if he had invented a trick. Mag and Elsie took to setting cups on a plank so no one spoiled their skirts. The blacksmith moved the bucket of sand near the candles. Wexler pinched the wick of a lantern that had begun to smoke. The square shifted and settled until the doing fit the saying. Lila cut the round loaf and put a small piece in each open palm. Honey went over it in a shine. The taste changed the shape of mouths. The widow who always frowned felt something move and let it stay. The girl with the broom forgot the broom and leaned on the handle like it had always been a post. Children licked their thumbs and came back for the scrape of sugar from the plate that holds nothing and still holds something. Ben stood by the post and held a candle that had burned low. He watched the wax fold and make small rivers. He lifted the end of the wick with a stick to keep the light. He set the candle on the rim where a gap asked for filling. He looked up and found Eli watching him. Eli nodded once, light to light. The old hen clucked. A child giggled, and then covered his mouth, as if the noise might break the roof of light. Lila crouched by the cage and slid 2 fingers through the slats. The hen pecked and then settled into her straw. The sign swung once and went quiet. Snow began to fall so fine that it turned to wet on your face before you could name it. It hissed when a fleck met a candle and vanished. The flames did not mind. Lanterns rocked and found the line again. The banner lifted once, made a wave, and fell back to its lazy hang. The whole square breathed in the same measure for a time. Sister Leonie led the children in a soft hum that did not belong to any book. It traveled in a circle around the well and back through them. Eli stood at Lila's side and listened. The sound filled a space he had not known could still hold sound. He glanced at the post where a different paper had hung. Wind had worked the staples free months back. Only the holes remained. He looked away. Wexler, who had seen births and deaths and the steady march between set, a last candle in a bare spot, and blew warm air into his hands. He looked at Lila the way a man looks at a sign he has been walking toward and only now reads. He tipped his chin to her and to Eli and to the children who had found places to lean that were not corners. Lila felt the pebble in her pocket and the linen of the stitched notebook against her ribs, paper and stone. Her hand found Eli's for an instant that could have been longer or shorter and still been enough. He did not close his fingers over hers because sometimes a touch should be light to be true. She drew in the smell of smoke and wax and wool and the sweet that clung to their sleeves. She watched the ring of tiny fires at the well and saw how they held at the same height because people had set them there on purpose. Names rose on boards and sank into stone. The square made a soft noise of talk and feet and the small laughter that comes when weight shifts. The well wore its light the way a new mother wears her shawl. Snow ticked on the brim and melted. The rope guard held. The hen settled again and closed her eye. The banner lifted one more time and lay down. The lantern stayed bright until the night deepened to a kinder dark. When people began to turn toward home, they did not go all at once. They moved in 2s and 3s and took their new names with them, like a warm coin in a pocket, something to touch with a finger when the road went dim. Lila gathered the empty plates. Ben carried the crate of chalk back to Wexler's porch. Maisie held her board and watched the candles until each flame had been pinched between 2 wet fingers by careful hands. Eli lifted the cage from the rim and stepped back so others could pass. He watched the square without trying to keep it the same as it had been an hour ago. Light clung to the stones after the last wick went out. It is a trick of the eye when you stand too long near warmth. It looks like a glow and feels like a memory finding its voice. The 4 of them stood a moment longer, with the well at their backs and the banner above, and the boards along the street carrying names that had not lived there in the morning. Then they turned toward the road that led away from the square and walked together, sleeves brushing pockets full of small things that held more than they weighed. Morning came clear and thin. The square kept the shape of last night in small ways, wax rings on the stones around the well, soot on the tips of fingers that had pinched out wicks. A lantern forgotten on a post flickered once and went out on its own as the sun found it. The banner drooped and showed the brush lines where a careful hand had made curves. Unnaming day. The letters looked softer in daylight. Frost picked at the edges of Maine. A light wind snapped laundry on 2 lines and set the smell of soap moving. Wexler swept his porch with a push broom and found chalk dust in the cracks. He pushed it into a little pile and left it there like a drift. A girl sat on the steps of the chapel and traced her new name on her palm with a finger. She smiled, as if the lines tickled. At the post near the store, a paper had taken water and blurred. Someone had tried to smooth it with a hand and made a darker stain. The print no longer held a face. It held a wash of ink that was only a shape. A bent staple clung to the wood at one corner. The other corner had gone free and flapped twice before the staple gave, and the paper slid down the post. It lay on the boardwalk and drank the sun until it curled. Wexler let it lie. On the ridge above town, a rider put his horse to a line that let him see the square without being seen. He sat and watched the ring of stones with its new soot crown and the lantern ropes that made a roof when there was no roof. He saw people move slow in the blue cold. He saw a small family walk together under the banner. He touched the brim of his hat with a gloved finger and put it down again. He shifted in the saddle. His horse snorted a small cloud. He turned the animal with a knee and took the faint trail that slid toward the north range. Snow lifted under the hooves and fell back with a hush. At the Stonefields gate, the new sign held light. Moisture from the night had settled into the cuts. The letters looked deeper. Ben stood under the plank and checked the screws with his thumb. They held. He moved the plank a fraction with his palm to hear if it spoke. It did not. He picked up a handful of frozen corn for the hens and scattered it in the yard. The old hen from the cage strutted to the front and pecked like she had always lived there. Maisie came out with hair gone everywhere and her board under one arm. She set the board on the fence and blew on her fingers. Honey drop. She told the letters again just to be sure they remembered. She leaned her head against Lila's coat when Lila stepped to the gate. Lila smelled like cinnamon and smoke and wool still damp along the hem where snow had licked it. Eli came from the lean-to with the bridle over his shoulder. He had the look of a man who had slept and not slept. He stopped in the yard and took in the sign, the boards, the frost crust that would break under a boot. He looked at the horizon and marked the line of clouds that would not trouble them for hours. He set the bridle on the fence post and rolled his shoulders as if making room for the day. Inside the house, the fire had settled into a low bed with a red core. Lila laid a split and leaned in until the heat touched her face. She set a skillet on the hook and poured a thin batter with a sure hand. The first cake took heat and spoke soft. Coffee worked up a whisper in the pot. Maisie dragged a chair with both hands until she could climb and sit where she could see the skillet. Ben came in and took a plate from the shelf without scraping ceramic on wood. He set forks out with the calm of habit. Eli stood in the doorway and watched a moment. His eyes tracked small things. The nick on the table edge he knew by feel, the spoon on the shelf with the C near the handle, the boots by the peg clean the leather rubbed with fat, the apron with flower prints